All coming up, Dr. Azwi Faneri Nemushungwa, economics lecturer at the University of Venda, helps us unpack the recent interest rate hike. Also, international relations consultant Dr. Charles Sinkala and senior researcher Lazi Somya weigh in for more as we explore what happened on the international front and its impact on South Africa. A very good afternoon. If you've just joined us, we are live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. You are watching The Week in Review with myself, Liesl Wilson. Now, it is the program where we're going to take a look at some of those big stories to come of the week, what's made headlines, and as always, keep South Africans talking. Let's get straight into it. Let's start off this week by taking a look at the 67 Blankets for Madiba campaign. Pulled out all the stops in celebrating its 9th anniversary. The initiative, a knitting revolution in honor of the late global icon Nelson Mandela and his legacy, was started back in December of 2013 after a challenge laid down by his former private secretary, Zelda Lagrange, for people to make a difference for those in need.
Starting them young to learn how to be of service to others.
I would say why it's important is because it shows how much of an involvement the youth can have in society.
As us as youth, we can help the poor people in need, so we can show some love to the community.
So we can help our fellow human beings, especially the poor who are in need.
If not us, then who?
Knitting and stitching together to make the world just a little bit warmer for those in need. The initiative that began on social media has blossomed into a worldwide movement with knitting groups in countries like America and India.
When Zelda first presented me with this challenge, it seemed like an absolutely impossible task. But you know, Madiba did say, it always seems impossible until it's done. I can comfortably say that we have not made 67 blankets in the past 9 years, but over 67,000 blankets. But at least 120,000 blankets, which means that 120,000 people in South Africa alone have been kept warmer over the cold winter months because of our efforts.
It's evolved into a movement of knitwits, women and men, young and old, who knit, stitch, sew, crochet, and weave blankets and scarves which are distributed to the poor all over the world. For this veteran, the true measure of a leader is one who lives a life of service and doesn't just take with impunity.
And today, the world over, too many leaders, too many who we have given our trust to, have trampled on it. And the consequences are devastating all over the world when you switch on the TV. You see it. And those who bear the brunt are those with the least voice and agency.
The former Deputy Chief Justice, who served 10 years on Robben Island with Madiba, called for a renewal and reset of the state to uplift the morale of the entire society.
Good people give. Bad people take. Have you got that? Good leaders give. Their thought, their vision, their loyalty to their people. And bad leaders take. And take for themselves.
The judge also weighed in on the frustration caused by load shedding.
But we ought to have agency, preparedness to do things and change our circumstances. Plant a little tree there, a little vegetable there, knit blankets, make sure that things work around you. For damn God's sake, give us electricity. Make sure that it works. Make sure that Eskom works.
With 6 months to Mandela Day 2023, they're encouraging everyone to do their part, to show care and compassion to those in need, and bring back hope to their lives. Nozintombi Mia, SABC News.
In other news that made headlines this week, the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, has increased the repurchase rate by 25 basis points to 7.25%. Economists have predicted the hike, citing the surprise decrease in the consumer price index. Perhaps for this and more, we're joined by Dr. Azwifanele Mushunga, economics lecturer at the University of Venda. For more, a very good afternoon to you, Dr. Azwi, and thank you for your time here at the SABC.
Thank you, afternoon, and to the listeners of SABC.
Right, so we saw the news coming through this week. Prime lending rate just on our screen sitting at 10.75%, and obviously having increased by 25 basis points. Let's unpack that. The South African Reserve Bank announced the 8th consecutive interest rate hike. This was since the central bank began its hiking cycle at the end of 2021. Some say the increase could have been worse. Were you expecting this?
I can say I was expecting this, seeing what is happening in the economy, especially when inflation is still escalating like now. Food prices increasing, also the problem of fuel price also increasing. We know these are administered prices, or we call them the volatile prices. So if these prices continue to increase or to hike, the possibility is that the Reserve Bank is left with no option except to increase or to hike the repo rate.
Speaking of the motivation cited by the Reserve Bank, does the hike of the repo rate make sense given the already high levels of interest that we are experiencing? How would you weigh in on that, and perhaps explain why for those who don't really understand?
I think it makes sense for the fact that we know that the South African Reserve Bank has adopted a policy called the inflation targeting policy. So where the Reserve Bank aims at stabilizing the price. So when the Reserve Bank realized that there is inflation or the price continues to increase, so in order to stabilize price or to keep the prices within the range, that is the range of 3 to 6%, which for now we know that is already above 6%. So the Reserve Bank is left with no option, because we know that if inflation continues, so it means that the value of the rand will be eroded. So as an overseer of monetary issues in the economy, so the Reserve Bank had to opt swiftly in order to solve the problem. And the only option that the Reserve Bank has is only to use the increase in repo rate as a way of trying maybe to discourage or to try to punish, especially inflation that is occurring. Because even if the Reserve Bank may decide not to do anything, so it won't be a solution. So I believe they are doing the right thing by hiking the interest rate.
All right, so you've analyzed that relationship, and with the repo rate increasing by 25 basis points and the prime lending rate sitting at 10.75% at this point, can we expect more? I'm only asking this because, you know, with all these figures that have been thrown around, what is this also going to then mean for the ordinary South African who is already struggling financially?
Number one, to answer the first question, so I don't see any possibility of a reduction in interest rate in the near future. Number one, if we check the global economy, so we know that they've embarked on what we call normalization policy, where almost all the banks or the central banks of the world, they are trying to use their interest rate as a way or trying maybe to solve the problem that the economy is facing. So in the issue of an ordinary South African, so we can say that this is an unfortunate thing, but unfortunately, we know that the Reserve Bank is left with no option. However, we can say that to an ordinary South African, somebody just stayed somewhere wondering what's happening. Number one, we know that when interest rate increases, somebody may say, I don't have a loan or any debt with the bank. Unfortunately, whatever we buy, so it is affected indirectly or directly. So we know that even if I don't have a loan with a particular bank, but when I go and buy something, especially when I buy those things on a loan basis or on credit, automatically I know that all these items, there is an element of interest attached. Unfortunately, we find that those producers, because in order to expand production, most of them have to go to financial institutions to borrow funds. So as a way of pushing the pain or that cost that they've incurred from the financial institution. They'll be forced to increase the price of the final good, which means that at the end of the day, an ordinary citizen will be affected directly or indirectly.
Well, speaking of, the consumers' pockets being affected indirectly and directly, the petrol price is also expected to increase this coming week alone.
Yes, we know that for now, we can say that the South African citizens, we're faced with high financial pressure. You know that there is this issue of electricity that is expected to increase in April. We also have a fuel price that is expected to increase next week. We know that all these prices or these increases has to face the pace of the ordinary citizen. So we know that if all these hikes are facing the ordinary citizen, at the end of the day, we can say that the money that you'll be using or an increase that has come affecting your purse, it means that some of the basic items that you were forced to buy, so you'll have to do away with, meaning that in particular, we can say that your purse will be eroded. So this is not good news to ordinary South Africans. Even those who are rich, I believe this time they're feeling the pinch.
Dr. Azwi, we're also looking at, the sentiments around the role of Reserve Bank. It came up this week again. In a year of high inflation, also amid, rising interest rates, we've seen the role of the central banks also coming under scrutiny. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the political developments surrounding the Reserve Bank to date, particularly on the back of the conference that wrapped up for the African National Congress in in January. All right, Dr. Azwi Fanele, I do believe we're having some technical issues. We'll have to leave that conversation there. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Azwi Fanele Nemushunga is economics lecturer at the University of Venda, weighing in on the back of the MPC, having announced the increase of the repo rate by 25 basis points. I believe that Dr. Azwi is back. Let's try reconnect and see if we can continue with that conversation. Dr. Azwi, if you can hear me, please give me some sort of indication. We were just...
Yes,
all right, so you're back. All right, thank you so much. We were just in conversation about the role of the central banks, which have now come under scrutiny. I think just in an era of high inflation and rising interest rates, I was trying to understand what your thoughts are on the political developments surrounding the Reserve Bank. This is just also on the back of the African National Congress's 55th elective conference that also wrapped up earlier this month.
So I believe politics plays a greater role as far as any change that comes into the economy is concerned. So we cannot rule out the issue of that there is political interference. Now we are talking about the issue of rising or increasing in the prices of electricity. So where I believe that if there is a political intervention and the ANC has to do something that I believe will be a good move, is just to maybe to feel for the South Africans who are suffering, because that issue of just allowing NERSA to increase the price of electricity and then they say there is nothing that they can do. I believe that we can say that they don't have what you call the political willingness to do that. Not that they cannot do anything, because seeing that everything is rising in South Africa, ordinary South Africans are suffering. Somebody can say that the present government needs to be blamed, and we cannot just say that they don't have anything to do. They have, because they have the political power to can do that. Unfortunately, we don't see any commitment with the present government to say we want to do something to change the status quo. So it is business as usual. So we can say that this has to do with political interference, because I believe there is something that they can do. They know what is good for South Africa. Unfortunately, they're not doing it.
So then on the back of that, when we look at the main drivers of this hike to date, also on a macroeconomic level, the war in the Ukraine that's ongoing with no end in sight, perhaps you could speak to that. And then also, as we look for solutions, what could people then do to mitigate against this rising cost of living that's obviously contributed to their dire situation in this economy?
So on the side of consumers themselves, like I said, it seems like the government is not ready to do anything. So we cannot just sit as citizens and say there is nothing that we can do. I believe it's time that we have to make up our minds, seeing the situation that we're facing, the cost of living is too high. One has to revisit one's expenditure to say, let me live or just focus on the necessities, because I don't think it's time where you can just go out and make debts and then you go for those luxuries. We have to switch off from maybe living a life of luxury, and then we come to our senses that we better just settle for the ordinary, and then we buy those things that are necessary until all these things come back to normal. Because for now, life is difficult. You cannot just continue as if everything is okay.
Let's leave the conversation there. Dr. Azwi Fanelini Mushunga, economics lecturer at the University of Venda. Thank you very much for your time. Weighing in on the back of the Reserve Bank's MPC, having increased the repo rate by 25 basis points. It's now sitting at 7.25%. Again, thank you very much to her for her time. In other finance news, more South Africans are joining calls for a national state of disaster on the electricity crisis. This came out at the Energy Dialogue hosted by the Black Business Council. They say the state of disaster will allow government to treat the electricity crisis as an emergency by allocating more resources to respond to the challenge.
It's a race against time as various sectors and captains of industries make their voices louder on solutions around resolving the country's energy challenges. The Black Business Council wants, among others, a national state of disaster declared on the country's energy crisis. The Black Business Council brought together various experts in the energy industry to explore solutions to resolve the energy crisis.
People and professionals, entrepreneurs, and the range of other majority of the people that happen to be black in this country, they hope on us. And I think that's where we need them to start from, in terms of how then do we deal with the ESCOM, how do we deal with energy in terms of dealing with the security of energy in the country. And I'm saying these are some of the issues that we are advancing.
Most speakers agree that the government must treat the crisis of the rolling blackouts with the urgency it deserves and take input set down in the Black Business Council's white paper on solutions to the power crisis into consideration.
We believe we've reached a stage where we need more powerful levers, and we believe declaring a state of disaster is one of those levers, because it will then allow for faster turnaround on some of the key remedial actions, as we've seen with COVID. That's the first thing that I think we want to put out there. Number two, strengthen and empower the ESCOM governance structures to manage the state of disaster conditions. If you go into state of disaster, you may have to review the governance of ESCOM and say, what must I do to strengthen it so that they may work through the state of disaster.
The country has experienced rolling blackouts for 16 years now. Economists say the reason the country still finds itself here is as a result of the lack of political will from the ruling party.
Unfortunately, South Africa for the last 16 years has refused to be accountable, or rather the South African government has refused to be accountable for what has been happening in terms of load shedding. We've been ushered from one crisis to the other, and I think unfortunately we might have reached the precipice of this disaster. I do join the calls of numerous people such as the BBC Black Business Council who are calling for a national state of disaster on the electricity crisis. This is especially imperative because not only is it driving economic issues and our economic downfall ultimately, but one thing that perhaps people are not recognizing is that it is calling for a regime change as well.
Government's representatives have welcomed the recent public engagements and partnership to deal with the energy crisis.
The important point for this meeting is the layer that is outside of government, which we call additional capacity, has been mobilized. And I believe, engagements with people outside of government also enhances the options that we look at. So there's certain external experts that we are also borrowing from, project managers, legal experts, and policy experts, energy policy experts.
Some attending the BBC's Energy Indaba have threatened to take to the streets, saying their businesses and the economy are in dire straits as load shedding persists.
As the black people, we are saying now it's time for us to do exactly what we have done during apartheid, to let the government know that we are not satisfied with the way they are driving or governing the country. Then the only language that they understand properly is when we do as we have done with apartheid. It was not defeated in the boardrooms, it was defeated on the street. Now we go into the street to force the government, our current democratic government, to implement things that we have suggested to them.
Finance Minister Godongwana is expected to, in the budget next month, announce major debt relief for Eskom, but the black industrialists, engineers and economists at the BBC Energy Indaba believe that won't be enough of a measure to end the current load shedding. They'll present their white paper to the president in the coming days as they believe a state of disaster will see concerted efforts and help unlock resources that will help the economy and ensure stability of the country's grid. SABC News, Johannesburg.
Right, so we'll leave it there and take a quick ad break. Continue with more news on the other side. We take a look at what happened on the international front and perhaps its impact on South Africa when we return. We'll be right back. Right, welcome back. We continue in other news now. You're watching the Weekend Review. All eyes were on South Africa this week as global powers descended to its shores. Let's take a look at what transpired. We start off with U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen's visit to South Africa as part of her two-week tour of Africa. South Africa Finance Minister Godongwana described the meeting as a momentous occasion.
The last time that a U.S. Secretary of the Treasury visited South Africa was in 2014. 8 years ago. This is therefore indeed a momentous occasion. There has been constructive cooperation between our two countries through the G20 and the Financial Stability Board, including on making appropriate regulation standards for the financial sector.
Yellen echoed similar optimistic sentiments between SA-US relations.
The United States strongly values our relationship with South Africa. The minister and I will discuss how multilateral development banks can better address global challenges and how that can benefit African countries. And we will discuss South Africa's role in developing the pandemic fund.
Anti-money laundering, improving access to jobs, health and energy, climate financing and sovereign debt resolution in Africa topped the agenda during bilateral engagements. Yellen's trip is a run-up to an Africa visit by US President Joe Biden later this year. Yellen's visit to SA ends on Saturday. Meanwhile, military officials received Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Monday. The visit comes as South Africa prepares for joint naval drills with Russia and China next month, coinciding with the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. This is Lavrov's second Africa visit in 6 months, ahead of the Russia-Africa summit scheduled for later this year.
Of your allegiance to the key national interest of South Africa.
He's also set to visit Eswatini, Botswana and Angola before returning back to Moscow. This week, Minister Naledi Pandor also spoke at the SA-EU Ministerial Political Dialogue with the EU High Representative Joseph Borrell, touching on many themes. SA International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor encouraged cooperation and the need to work together.
The pandemic compelled countries and regions to seek ways of working together. And we need to do this with respect to all other global challenges, including the war between Ukraine and Russia.
Minister Pandor also lauded the growing economic bilateral relationship while emphasizing the responsibility of BRICS bloc to lead emerging economies in a challenging global landscape.
It must also allow us to enhance cooperation at different levels of engagement such as within the SADC-EU collaboration, the African Union-EU partnerships, and at the United Nations and other fora in which we measure and discuss global progress and solutions.
South Africa remains impartial to the Ukraine-Russia conflict and was one of 15 African nations to abstain from the UN vote in March to condemn Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Instead, it offered to mediate in the Ukraine-Russia conflict as a neutral party.
Our relationship must always remain a balanced one, in keeping with our own goals and objectives, while at the same time seeking mutual benefit. It is not just South Africa or African countries who should play a role in seeking peace. It is all of us who must work together to seek to arrive at a negotiated outcome that address the concerns of all the parties involved.
For SABC News, I'm Lisa Wilson. Right on the back of that, international relations consultant Dr. Charles Sinkala and senior researcher Lwazi Somya weigh in for more as we explore what happened on the international front and its impact on South Africa. Very good afternoon to the both of you, and thank you for your time here on the SABC.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
All right, Lwazi, let me start with you. Dr. Charles, you're welcome to add in your sentiments after. Just given the changing geopolitical landscape, what were some highlights from both visits for you?
I think Africa now has been recognized as a participant for the world geopolitical influence, and I think we will see so many more visitation from the outside, especially from Europe and the United States of America. And I think the visitation from the military defense minister from Russia also brings an understanding of the core of bilateral relationship with South Africa, especially looking at the relationship with South Africa and Russia. But again, we have to consider that South Africa houses as well the embassy of Ukraine. I think even though they take the neutral part, they must balance the equation to make sure that these issues are discussed towards the end of the conflicts within that country. In other way as well, we have seen the visitation from Treasury from the United States of America, which has continued to facilitate trade between Africa and the United States of America. My only call has been always that Africa must be on the table to negotiate in the interest of all Africans.
Lwazi, perhaps you could weigh in on your sentiments. I think just on the back of that, I also want to understand whether, the US did enough to persuade Africa, in your view, to take a harder line against Moscow. I'm also only asking this because many African countries abstained from voting on UN matters condemning the invasion of the Ukraine.
Yeah. So this is a long history, and especially relating to the Donald Trump administration, where the USA as a global actor undertook a more nationalist point of perspective and drove an agenda of America first. Part and parcel of that American first doctrine was American pulling out of its diplomatic engagement in multilateral institutions. So now with the Biden administration, what we see is America's re-engagement with the rest of the world and also the African continent. What is very important to note that is that last year already we had a visit by Anthony Blinken to South Africa, and now that South Africa is embarking on a chairpersonship of BRICS and later in 2025 chairperson of the G20, South Africa now becomes a very, very critical actor in international affairs, and therefore countries will try to influence the foreign policy directions of influential countries such as South Africa. We have long been arguing that South Africa is punching above its weight on the international scene. However, it's underpinned by the soft power that South Africa has, in particular the non-aligned position that South Africa has had as an interlocutor between multilateral institutions, along with our countries that conflict, as we have seen with the Eritrean and Ethiopian conflict, where South Africa played safe houses. So in this week itself represented a very busy week for the diplomatic community within South Africa, in particular relating to the future progress of multilateral institutions. However, what should be underpinned is that this is an evolving situation. Even in times of conflict, diplomacy and international relations still remain paramount for all countries engaged in.
Dr. Charles, just on the back of what Lazi echoed, speaking about the soft power of South Africa and our non-aligned positions, just as we look at the continent at large, does the competition for alliances in Africa work to Africa's advantage or disadvantage? In the same breath, how can Africa not be dictated to by geopolitical actors at this point?
I wouldn't say that South Africa has got a soft position in terms of soft power on the continent. I think South Africa has got a very, very hard position, and I think its positioning on the continent, especially as it chairs the BRICS forum, is very, to an extent that it is very influential. We can see how President Biden invited President Cyril Ramaphosa to the United States of America to make up a decisive action to condemn Russia. You know, we can see that South African position cannot be underestimated. But the call for the world to work with Africa cannot come short now. As I'm speaking to you, that there is some negotiations which has been going on for a very long time, and Africa now shall have a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. To that, Africa now will be the majority voter at that council, and its presence to be with allies from the outside, whether the United States of America or the West, will be very influential. That's why you can see that Russia now has started conversing around Africa to create allies, and as well, I'm sure Ukraine as well is doing that, and many other European countries. We cannot underestimate the power and the influence of Africa that it has, notwithstanding the fact that we have spoken about the mineral rich and the exports of minerals and the abundance of natural resources. The question is, since now we realize that South Africa, the rest of Africa, is very influential and plays a very pivotal role in the world, we must use that emphasis and advantage to the world to negotiate on the benefit of all Africans.
Lazi, Dr. Charles begs to differ on your point about South Africa being a soft power. Perhaps we could talk to the ANC's, the ruling party's allegiance to Russia. Obviously, in its fight against apartheid, perhaps also opposing being victims to imperialism, amongst others. Did that narrative come out strong? Ideologically, what is our stance? I'm asking this because we also see that next month there's a military exercise with both Russia and China that coincides with the anniversary of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And many are questioning whether this was deliberate timing or not. What message is that then ultimately sending?
So here's the position on non-alignment. It is derived from the World War II context, where it was the Cold War and multiple sides, the major powers, right, contestation at war. Now, the issue here at hand is that the Global South took upon a position to be non-aligned with any other these warring parties and countries. And part and parcel of this is ensuring that part of the non-alignment is working and leveraging upon the diplomatic relations that one has with all sides at hand. And here comes the kicker with the issue of soft power. While hard power itself is the militaristic and also economic leveraging tools countries have, South Africa does not necessarily have that. But however, it is seen as the entry point towards the African continent, and therefore part and parcel of South Africa's agenda, as we see and then take upon the BRICS chairpersonship, is ensuring that the African voices are heard, along with its potential presidency in 2025 concerning the G20, to represent African voices well. Now, what this means is that the ANC itself aligns itself with the notion of progressive internationalism, and Liso, you perfectly unpacked what it means. But however, this notion of progressive internationalism needs to be met out with some form of consistency. What has been lacking in the consistency of the application of foreign policy of progressive internationalism with the South African government and the ruling party is that it does not see material conditions the same way. For example, they have a fundamental problem with the occupation of Palestine, but yet we will take a non-aligned position concerning issues around the Russia-Ukraine war. We also are not consistent with the efforts and solidarity efforts with those oppressed within our region and our continent due to the mere fact we have diplomatic considerations to take hand of. So now the issue of South Africa's credibility on the international community in terms of its different pronunciations on foreign policy itself becomes in question. So now what we see more recently under the Ramaphosa administration within South Africa's foreign policy is now an attempt to realign and rationalize South Africa's foreign policy, even though some of the inconsistencies still persist. And that understanding is that how we rationalize foreign policy under the Ramaphosa administration, how we've analyzed it, is that we do away with haphazard agreements towards what multilateral institutions are putting forward, similar to the COVID-19 pandemic with the SWIFT application, similar to now with the UN Security Council program, and including on the sanctions on Zimbabwe. What was more fascinating more recently is what was not said within these engagements between the USA, the EU, and Russia, is that South Africa has been lodging a campaign on sanctions on Zimbabwe. And the Minister of Finance did not raise this issue with Janet Yellen, especially concerning the Zadira sanctions. And there were also issues around our engagements with the European Union, where we have this agreement holding our trade with them, but it doesn't translate with the equality of the relationship. So there are many issues to be unpacked concerning these visits this week. However, we might require more time to unpack them fully.
Absolutely, and that is a concern. But obviously, what both of you echoed brings political economy of South Africa under the spotlight. And, we have to look at what is viable for South Africa on that front and what our geostrategic positioning also looks like. In conclusion, though, let me start with Dr. Charles Lwazi. I'll end up with you. During the EU summit co-chairing that Minister Naledi Pandor held this week as well, she spoke about the responsibility of the BRICS bloc, in leading emerging economies, amongst many other issues. But Lavrov then also, during his trip in Eritrea, discussed the issue of adopting resolutions of currency and not using the dollar to trade with the loan. I wonder, how you'd weigh in on that. What are your thoughts? How is this also going to affect the geopolitical landscape if adopted? Dr. Charles, let me start with you.
I think, Lizo, now as we talk about globalization in the world, individual countries have got the interest in their hand. And I think that's what we need to understand. United States of America won't be happy to drop their currency in terms of trade on the world market, as well as all other African countries, including the world countries, would like to put their currency on the map, which has adversely affected their economical participation. As you can see, the exchange between the greenback and the dollar and the rand in South Africa, it is almost 20 rand. If you go further to the north, it is even about 800 naira to a dollar. If you come here to Zambia, it is also almost to 19 kwacha to a dollar. So these discrepancies and inconsistency in terms of trade, it is very sensitive. As long as the countries, do not put up a global agenda to tackle economical activities on the continent, it becomes a scramble for who has what and who has more.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. Lwazi, in conclusion, how would you weigh in, perhaps as we wrap up this discussion?
Ultimately, whilst these meetings were important, but what South Africa does going forward will be much more important, especially considering the positionality South Africa possesses within the international community. And part and parcel of that is ensuring that you leverage off and play off these different sides that are currently in conflict and ensure that South Africa and the African continent's national and continental interest is best served throughout your engagements.
All right, we'll leave that conversation there. Thank you to the both of you for joining us here on the SABC, echoing those sentiments. International Relations Consultant Dr. Charles Sinkala, Senior Researcher Lazi Somya weighing in on what happened on the international front this week and perhaps how this is ultimately also impacting South Africa and beyond. So we'll leave that there for now. Take another ad break and continue on the other side. Welcome back. The Weekend Review continues. Let's turn our attention to some of the political stories that we saw unfold this week.
Viva DA, viva! Viva! Viva South Africa, viva! Viva! Rise, South Africa, rise up! Rise!
It's been a week of high drama in the world of South African politics. Here are some of this week's top political news. On Tuesday, the Public Protector's Office announced that it had completed an investigation into the events that transpired on the President's Phala Phala game farm. The Public Protector's Office has been investigating whether Cyril Ramaphosa may have violated the Executive Ethics Code in relation to the theft of thousands of US dollars on his Limpopo farm at the request of the African Transformation Movement. The Public Protector says its Phala Phala investigative team has obtained, reviewed and validated all information and evidence prior to finalizing its preliminary report. The pending report is not open to the public. The DA marched to the ANC head office, Luthuli House in Johannesburg on Wednesday. The opposition party accused the governing party of deliberately engineering the country's energy crisis. Eskom is currently implementing stages 3 and 4 power cuts. The march comes days after the National Energy Regulator of South Africa approved an 18.6% tariff hike by Eskom for the 2023-2024 financial year.
Pansy with 18.65%. Pansy. Forward to energy security. Forward. Forward. We don't have an Eskom problem. We don't have a NERSA problem. We've got an ANC problem in South Africa. And that's why we're here. That's why we're not wasting our time at the Union Buildings or Megawatt Park.
On Friday, Al Jamaha's Thapelo Ahmad was elected executive mayor of the city of Johannesburg. He won by 138 votes, while Mpho Phalatse received 81 and Action SA's Funzi Ngobeni got 46.
If we are proxies of the communities, because not every community member will be here and participate in legislating the laws, but we are mandated by them and we are here to deliver those services.
All right, so for more on these stories, we're joined by Asanda Nkhoasheng, a political analyst. Asanda, good afternoon. Thank you for your time here on the SABC.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
Let's start off with the DA's march that took place in Johannesburg and Cape Town, and perhaps how you'd weigh in on whether that was the right move in the right direction as the country is facing rolling blackouts. Or was this just a publicity stunt? Was it them officially kicking off their campaign ahead of 24 elections? What was achieved?
I think that, it makes sense that an opposition party would start a march, particularly one that's going to go towards the governing party that they are trying to unseat as the opposition party. So it wasn't surprising that the DA would make a move like that. But what is said, though, is that what the DA is refusing to take responsibility for is that we are in the situation as a country, in part because they, as the opposition party, have failed to dislodge the ANC. They've failed to present a viable option that South Africans can vote for. And most importantly, they failed in using the instruments that are available to them in terms of parliament, in terms of the courts, and various other methods available to them, particularly as the opposition party, that they could have used to ensure that there is more accountability and that there is less corruption within the ANC, and that the ANC is basically taken to task at each point where they have transgressed. Because you must remember that the DA is part of the same government that has delivered load shedding. It's part of these conversations conversations. They have shadow ministers and they attend committee meetings, energy committee meetings, security committee meetings, and they also attend meetings with their president, which John Steenhuisen was very quick to tell us that he has been part of. And none of those meetings have yielded the results, which is South Africa without an energy crisis. And, we have had the load shedding problem since 2007. And so the DA itself has had many, many, many years to try and implement an energy safe solution. For example, in the province that they do govern, which is in the Western Cape, to show us that it is possible and to show us that as the opposition, they can deliver so that most South Africans can vote for them.
Thank you for sharing those sentiments. So what you're saying is that it's been easy for politicians or opposition to assign blame and take the ANC, but not take the ANC to task enough and perhaps provide enough solutions. So when we saw, what the ANC Youth League then did by coming out to protect Luthuli House, what transpired there in terms of those dynamics? Was that necessary, and also what ultimately also represented on that front?
I think the ANC, it's not surprising again that they would use their own people to protect their kind of headquarters and even the Cape Town office, which is quite a big office. So I wasn't surprised by that move. I think it's sad that, people are so in denial about the role that the ANC has played in leading this country to this energy crisis and therefore an economic crisis and also a security crisis. It shows a lack of self-reflection of ANC member and a lack of kind of accountability, in that if you are a political party that understands that you have done wrong and that where we are as South Africans is not where we want to be, the last thing you should be doing is defending yourself in the ways that those members were doing. But this is classic ANC, action. It's obfuscate, defend, obfuscate, defend. That's what they do. And so it wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing, because this was an opportunity where they could have admitted that they've done wrong and spoken about how they're going to try and turn things around rather than defend themselves using members of their political party.
Speaking of which, then the purpose of the march was to also deliver a memorandum, and it's not clear if that was delivered or received. How does that also impact the effectiveness of what transpired this week alone then?
Well, this is why I went back to say the DA has various methods and processes that they can use in order to access the president, e.g. the meetings that they have. So this march and the memorandum handing over was more symbolic than anything else. These people sit in parliament together, they attend meetings together. If the DA had anything to say to the president, they could have said it, and they can deliver it in parliament and various other platforms that they share as the governing party and the opposition party. Instead, what the DA should be doing is supporting all efforts to find a solution to this current crisis, because South Africans deserve better than this, whether it is the DA, not holding the ANC accountable, the DA failing themselves as an opposition party to provide a viable exit for people, and so on. And I think, this is one of those things where there are ample opportunities to work together as political parties across the spectrum to find solutions rather than spending time on the ground. And, I think it's important for South Africans in general, ordinary South Africans, to have platforms through which they can and should be protesting against this. But I think it's political opportunism for political parties to be hijacking these very valid citizen platforms and valid citizen concerns.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think because the DA had such an eventful week this week, if we look at what happened in Gauteng, Mpopalatse being ousted as the mayor of Johannesburg, and now Al Jama's Tapelo Ahmed is expected to be sworn in on Monday. And I wonder, is he up to the task? If we look at the issue of coalitions and how this is also, starting the conversations about where to come 2024 and beyond, what's also been reflected on that front?
I think, what has been happening in Gauteng, what has been happening not in Gauteng, but rather in Johannesburg, what has been happening in Ekurhuleni, what has been happening in Nelson Mandela Municipality and Tshwane Municipality is showing a lack of political maturity in opposition parties, who we are hoping will have enough maturity by 2024 to be able to hold a national government of coalition. They are failing at municipal level at a smaller, much more manageable scope, and I don't know how they're going to do it at a national level, and they are not helping themselves at all because they are feeding into the ANC's argument that the ANC represents stability and coalition governments represents instability, and that is what they keep showing us by being unable to hold together their own government. I mean, this is the second time that Mpo has been kicked out in a very short space of time. And now we have, some questions arising around, does it make sense from a democratic perspective to give somebody who has only 1% of the vote such an important seat? What does that say about the will of the people? What does that say about hearing the will of the people and the desires of the people? Because only 1% of people in Johannesburg wanted Al-Jamaa to be in the council in the first place. So what happens to the wants, the desires of the 99%, and how do you account for democracy and people having been given mandates through the vote if minority parties are going to start leading in ways that, the voter didn't really kind of bargain for? And this is going to need us to have conversations in terms of electoral policy, in terms of what are the limitations that we can put on, what size do you need to be in order for you to be able to have which position, et cetera, et cetera. And these are going to be difficult conversations, but they're important conversations because we can't have a situation where 99% of people's voices is ignored and 1% is the one that prevails, because that is a decision that makes sense for a certain political party that might be the majority to be able to retain power over another.
Yeah, definitely going to be part of the conversations we'll be having heading into 2024 elections and beyond. Let's leave it there for now. And just quickly on the back of, the DA and sort of what transpired between the DA and the ANC, the Public Protector's Office also confirmed this week that it completed the investigation into whether President Cyril Ramaphosa violated the Executive Members Ethics Act in the Phala saga. And we saw the ATM leading that in the front. And I wonder if we can expect the report to be accepted by the ATM and other parties. The question is it going to be aligned to what they had reported or challenged, or will it be different? How would you also weigh in on that as we await what's set to come out there?
I mean, I think it's very interesting, this particular case, because it is a report about the president and the president's actions. And normally public protectors' reports go to the president and are signed off by the president before public release. So it's going to be interesting to see how the process unfolds when it is the president that is under question and who it ends up going to for that final sign-off before release. And, we are yet to see what exactly they've decided or how they have kind of arbitrated in this particular scenario. And we can only, talk about it once we have the report and the report has been, clear on what it is, whether they think there were ethics that were, not dealt with or whatever the situation is. I have been saying even before the elective conference that we are stuck in a situation where we're going to have a president who's constantly going to be dragged from, various members and organs of state meant to hold the executive accountable. And we are going to have to suffer through that until the ANC removes Cyril Ramaphosa or South Africans figure out a way to hold an early election or, until 2024 or past, because we have a Cyril Ramaphosa who has a scandal, and the scandal is going to be hanging over his head for quite a long time, and it's going to be used by every other opposition political party to, bring some questions towards our president, which doesn't bode well for the president's office itself. It doesn't bode well for South Africa as well, because we are seen as a country that's being led by somebody who is corrupt and at the very least has some questions to answer for.
Asanda, let's leave that conversation there. Thank you for your time. You're on the SABC. Asanda Nkhoasheng, a political analyst, weighing on some of the top stories making headlines on the political front. Just like that, we've also come to the end of the show. Thank you for tuning in. Tomorrow we're back for a look at the week ahead from myself, Liesl Wilson, and the team. Until then, do take care. It's goodbye for now.